Hello, everybody. Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversations across the political spectrum, from center left to center right. I am Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark, sitting in for the great Mona Charen today. I'm joined by our regular panel, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Damon Linker of The Week, and Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. I know, Mona is I always, every time I sit in for her, I feel like I'm just taking the class down a few notches, but I'm going to do my best. I want to talk about CPAC. CPAC is a thing that when I was a young person in DC, I attended many times. And, we just had the annual, it stands for the Conservative Political Action Conference. And one of the things that I understood about CPAC when I was in a phase when I was going to it was that, everybody kind of joked it was like the conservative Star Wars cantina. Like it was well understood that it was, where the activists and kind of sometimes the weirder set showed up. And that didn't reflect the mainstream of the Republican Party, that it was really activist class. And I think the thing that strikes me about CPAC today, it is still very strange. It still features a tremendous amount of what I would consider fringiness, and yet it feels today like it reflects much more the actual mainstream of the Republican Party, that it is actually reflective of where certainly base voters are. Linda, you've been around the conservative movement a long time. Do you think that's accurate? Do you think that's happening?
Unfortunately, I think it's true. I mean, like you, I would occasionally go to CPAC, usually not to attend the conference, but as a speaker. I've spoken at CPAC a number of times. And it always struck me that particularly among some of the young men there, you mentioned Star Wars. I think I thought of it more as a Star Trek convention. The Trekkies were there, and these were guys that, didn't look like they had any place else to be on a Saturday night. I don't mean to be mean about it, but it's true. And you sort of just thought that it was very idiosyncratic. Well, now, of course, those folks have been replaced by the Qs, the QAnon folks who were there en masse. The mainstream of the Republican Party, however, does feel in some way, it seems, beholden to these people. And it says a great deal about what has happened to the party that I was once very happy to represent as a nominee for U.S. Senate from the state of Maryland. That party doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, one of the things that often happens at CPAC is the whoever is sort of the nominee for president, or in this case, when we're this far out, the people who are the wannabes, they come out to kind of hawk their wares and try out their shtick on the crowd. But of course, we still have a leader of the party, despite him being roundly defeated in the last election. And he came and gave an interesting speech. Damon, I know you had a piece on it this week. What did you think of Donald Trump's speech at CPAC?
Well, this is a good example of the need to separate out what I personally thought of the speech and then what my analysis of it was in the constellation of forces in the Republican Party. As a speech, it was appalling, and it was appalling in the way that all Trump speeches are, that it was a kind of seamless web of lies, distortions, exaggerations, conspiracies, jokes, kind of inside jokes that only people who watch like 18 hours of Fox News a week would get. But I do think, again, now putting on my analyst hat, that if you compare it to the really terrible speech that he delivered at Mar-a-Lago in April to a room full of party bigwigs and donors. That speech was just a terrible speech. It was self-pitying, bitter, focused on his own delusions about the last election, his loss, blaming everybody in his party and others. He used lots of vulgarity in that speech, swears, attacked Mitch McConnell by name using vulgarity and so forth. The speech just this last weekend at CPAC actually, I think, is something that those of us on this podcast and most of our listeners should be a little bit more concerned about, because I think he has figured out how to assimilate his own personal woundedness over the election into the story that he's been telling ever since he, burst on the scene as a candidate in the summer of 2015, which is he bragged about the accomplishments, such as they are, of his administration. He talked about where he thinks the party should go. Of course, it was lots of culture war stuff, critical race theory, and things related to that, blaming Joe Biden for every single thing under the sun, including the supposedly imminent disaster in Afghanistan, where Biden is actually following what Trump himself wanted to do, but he didn't care. He's ready to be prepared to blame Biden for that and to say Biden is stealing his idea of getting out of Afghanistan. So just kind of full spectrum nonsense, BS, and Trumpiness, combined with talking about how the election was this huge conspiracy where the left, Democrats, stole the presidency from himself and all of his voters. That synthesis of the big lie about the election with his usual populist appeals is exactly what he will need to do if he really does intend to run again in 2024. And the version of it that I heard that day, why is this appealing to people in this country, at least Republican voters? I couldn't begin to explain it really, but I do think that it was a much more effective version of his message than we got in April, and it had me a little concerned for that reason.
Yeah, we've actually got a clip of the speech that I want to play. Let's just drop in a little sound here.
We will never give up our search for truth and justice for what happened in the corrupt presidential election of 2020, because without that truth, we cannot have an honest election in 2022 or 2024, no matter what they want to tell you. The election fraud of 2020 is the single most requested topic for me and others to talk about, ahead of the border, even ahead of crime, because think of what they've done.
So, Bill, I really agree with Damon. I thought that this was a really strong in the sense that Trump sounded light. He sounded, he sounded indignant, but he was kind of on his game. And he made it very clear that central to their 22 and 24 message is going to be the idea that the election was stolen from him. And I've been worried, I guess, somewhat that for Republicans, Trump, whether he's actually on the ballot or not, he will sort of spiritually be on the ballot because it's all this grievance that the election was stolen. There's flags being made, 2024, the Trump revenge tour. And my concern is that actually for Democrats, Trump is not going to be on the ballot, and he's not going to be the kind of motivator that he was back in 18 and 2020 in terms of turning out Dems. What do you think? Do you think that's true?
Well, I think that for Democrats is a very legitimate worry. I can recognize all the signs of what I call asymmetrical mobilization. There was a dramatic example of that in 2018 when, if you looked at 2018 versus 2014, Democrats picked up 25 million votes in the midterm. I mean, it was a Democratic outpouring in response to their loathing of President Trump. And I don't think that you would have seen anything like that if Mr. Trump had not been president. So here we are, heading towards 4 years later, and I don't see any similar basis for Democratic Party mobilization in 2022. And unless the Biden legislative agenda goes very, very well, and unless Democrats can be mobilized around the issue of voting rights, which is certainly possible, then the odds are that Republicans are going to be more energized than Democrats. And that is not a good formula for the midterm. Let me make one other point, if I may. And that is, it is relatively unusual for defeated presidential candidates to remain central in their party. It's certainly not habitual Democrats. I mean, it's the usual formula for Democrats is one and done. If you've had your shot and you failed, you go away. And the party isn't particularly interested in revisiting the loss or renominating you. Trump is entirely different. He set himself the goal, I think, immediately after the defeat, which he doesn't acknowledge, of remaining not only central to his party, but at the top of his party. He is achieving that goal easily. The only other parallel that I can think of is William Jennings Bryan. And they are, I don't think it's any accident that they have a lot of other similarities as well as many differences. And so this is an unusual political feat that he's bringing off. And I think we need to think hard about how he's been able to do it and what the likely consequences will be.
Yeah, let me tag off of that. And anybody can jump in on this because I'm actually very curious about what people think. You know, part of it, to Bill's point, Trump maintains his perch at the top of the party, and you know, you can't beat something with nothing. And something that seemed clear at CPAC was, you know, you've got your Lauren Boeberts and your Kristi Noems and people who are showing up that people talk about kind of as presidential contenders, but there is nobody. I mean, I think I'm not positive I have this right, but they do the straw poll, and I think Trump kind of ran away with it. You know, he even talked at the podium about how if he wins the straw poll, it's the best poll that's ever happened. If he loses it, it's a terrible poll and it's fake news. But despite there's just nobody else who even sort of comes close in looking like they could lead the party going forward. And with that vacuum, I mean, maybe Ron DeSantis. Linda, did you see? Was there anybody that you saw that you thought, oh, that person could be the next standard bearer?
Well, first of all, let's remember that we are talking about CPAC, and everything we said at the beginning of the program still holds, and that is that CPAC, while it's true, it now more reflects the Republican Party, at least as the various state parties have been taken over by Trumpist voters and leaders. I guess I'm less pessimistic about this than some of the others on the program. I agree that 2022 is going to be more of a challenge for the Democrats. It is particularly going to be so if the issue of crime becomes the salient issue in the campaign, even though, you know, there's not a whole lot that can be done at the federal level on crime, it doesn't mean that it won't be an issue. I do think some of the wokeness in the Democratic Party is going to redound to the benefit of the Republicans. So, you know, I am concerned that the Trumpist wing is going to prevail. On the other hand, I guess I felt that Trump was diminished in watching him. I mean, now I watched only clips. I didn't actually turn into OAN or Fox to catch the whole thing live, but I did watch clips and I read the entire speech. And it seemed to me that he wasn't as much on his game. I mean, he didn't have any of that even his sort of racist tirade on immigration, it was sort of missing the rapists and drug dealers and criminals that were going to be flooding across the borders. He didn't have the kind of snappy phrase that he could use to sum up who the enemies were. I mean, he talked about immigration early in the speech. He talked about it at length. And it's true, he invoked the image of gangbangers and MS-13 that he claims to have vanquished from our cities, and that they're, coming across the border, I guess, disguised as 6-year-olds and 6-month-olds even. But, I don't know, it just, to me, he rambled much more than usual. He had mistakes and things he said. He got times confused. 6 months became 6 weeks. And there were just a lot of things in there that indicate to me that he is diminished. And, we're forgetting that he's got a lot of legal problems right now. And he's got a company that is under indictment. He has his CFO under indictment. He's got lots and lots of grifters that are surrounding him. There are a lot of people that are making money off of this. And I actually believe that much of this persona that we see when it's trotted out at places like CPAC is more about, keeping the grift going than it is about any coherent plan to enter the presidential race in 2024. And you do have people like Ron DeSantis who are going to make a go for it, as you do, others in the Senate, Josh Hawley and others who are going to try in 2024. Now, that may not help in 2022, but I'm not willing yet to concede that Trump will have the same kind of stranglehold over American politics that he has. He has largely disappeared. You would have to go out and search for that speech if you wanted to watch it. You couldn't just turn on, the news or your favorite cable channel and see it unless that channel was Fox. And even Fox had to have disclaimers at the bottom of the screen when he made outrageous comments about, the election having been stolen.
Yeah, that was a great moment. Does anybody want to argue with Linda on this point?
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, that sounds like Bill and I both would.
You first, Damon.
All I will say is the polling that we have so far, and it's somewhat meager because it's really, really far out. But the combination of the polling we do have with the straw poll at CPAC clearly shows that Trump has a commanding control over the party at the moment. Only DeSantis is anything like a rival, and he's almost always between 3 and 5 times below Trump. So if Trump is at 50%, DeSantis is at 10. If Trump is at 70, DeSantis is at like 15. So we're talking multiples below Trump. And then after DeSantis, there is just nobody. You have a ton of people who are around 3 and 4%. And people like Hawley, my goodness, Hawley very often doesn't even show up with 1% in these polls. Tom Cotton spends like half of his time on Fox. He comes in usually around 1%. So these now, again, very, very early, but short of, I don't know what, Trump, I think, will be able to win the nomination in 2024 if he wants it in a walk. Now, that's very different than the general election. I think general election, obviously, it's going to depend on tons of things we don't know yet, like how Biden is doing in about 18 different ways, how the economy is doing, if there's anything big in foreign policy that is creating a big mess for the president. But I think Trump, no matter what, will face tremendous headwinds in the general because half the country can't stand him. And And, it's not that often that a president loses re-election, and he did. So, yeah, him trying to kind of come back as the great savior after that, I mean, the American people would have to have a very serious case of amnesia to fall for that beyond the Republican Party. So I think that is sort of what we're facing, that if Trump wants it, it's going to be his. And then, I think it'll be Biden's to lose, but he could, because there are all those variables out there and we just don't know yet.
Bill, did you have something you wanted to add?
Just very quickly, there's the familiar distinction between Trump and Trumpism. And I hear various people vying to become the successor to Trump if he doesn't re-enter the fray formally. But I have yet to hear a powerful, organized case by a serious potential presidential candidate about a different course for the Republican Party and conservatism. The back to Reagan is simply not pragmatically or politically feasible at this point. But if not back to Reagan, then forward to what? What does this new conservative synthesis sound like that would be simultaneously anti-Trumpian and forward-looking? If there's a candidate who comes up with an answer to that challenge, then that would be an interesting race, but I have not seen it yet.
Oh, well, I guess just to kind of answer that, I don't think that there's an anti-Trump path forward. I think there's kind of a competence but Trumpy tone fusion path forward. Like, that's Ron DeSantis's pitch, right? His pitch is going to be, I was governor of a state. Look how well we did. Look how I handled COVID. But I yell at the press, and, I've got a really Trumpy style, and I've got a populist style, and I'm passing laws against critical race theory and, trans sports. And I'm a culture warrior the same way Trump is. I mean, I don't think there is a path forward at this point for the candidates that doesn't involve kind of a Trumpy thing. The only other thing I would say is that I do think when you make that allusion to the looking back to Reagan, I mean, I do think there's somebody like a Governor Hogan who'd like to occupy that lane under the theory that a mountain of Trumpists will all run and split, almost the inverse of what happened in 2016, and that they could potentially sneak through, with 30% of kind of the normal Republican vote. But I'm actually skeptical that is even a possibility at this point.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Mr. Hogan's theory of the case. More power to him, but I think we're in substantial agreement, Sarah. Ron DeSantis is Trumpism with a human face. And that means that Donald Trump has won the argument within the Republican Party. And there are no two ways about it.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that, by the way. I mean, I don't mean to say by my saying that Trump himself is diminished, that we're going to get, Larry Hogan as president, much as I might like that as a presidential nominee for the Republican Party. I don't disagree with any of that.
Well, there's another facet of CPAC, and I want to play one other clip here. But the main, if other than the election being stolen, grievances that were being aired, the other main theme was how bad the vaccines are. In fact, let's play the clip.
The government was hoping that they could sort of sucker 90% of the population into getting vaccinated, and it isn't happening, right? There's younger people are well aware of what the risks really are, and they're well aware of the side effect profile.
We're here to tell government, don't come knocking on my door with your Fauci outie. You leave us the hell alone.
And now they're starting to talk about going door to door to be able to take vaccines to the people. Think about the mechanisms they would have to build to be able to actually execute that massive of a thing. And then think about what those mechanisms could be used for. They could then go door to door, take your guns. They again go door to door, take your Bibles.
Yeah. So, okay.
Fauci, ouchie. I'm still stuck on Fauci, ouchie. That's about the level of maturity we just heard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is so it was a theme throughout the entire conference. Everybody seemed to be making speeches against the vaccines, and it comes at a time when right now we've got about 48% of the total share of Americans who are fully vaccinated, closer to 59% of adults sort of 18 and over who are fully vaccinated. But we need to get it much higher, and this Delta variant is spreading in red states. It is among these sort of Trump voters who have somehow managed to politicize the vaccine. You got people like Madison Cawthorn in that clip saying that the mechanism being used to go door to door would be used to come collect to give people, the vaccine would be used to collect people's Bibles and guns. I went from sort of accepting that Republicans were going to be silly about politicizing things like masks and sort of politicizing the vaccine to actually being, I am now extremely afraid that what Republicans are doing, like, it's always been dangerous, but we are capable of stopping this virus right now. But we just had a whole conference in which a bunch of the featured speakers and the Republicans, I mean, one of the things, Ron DeSantis is selling a shirt that says, "Don't Fauci my Florida." Like, he's selling that shirt. Kristi Noem, a big part of her speech was kind of sub tweeting or, was going after, without naming, Ron DeSantis, where she was saying she kept her state open the whole time, unlike some other Republican governors who claimed that they kept theirs open but actually had it shut down. I mean, they are all running to see who can be, in my opinion, the most pro-virus and the most anti-vax. And I guess my question, and Bill or Damon, I don't understand why Democrats aren't hitting Republicans harder on this issue. Like, this seems like a big offense opportunity. People are dying. We can't get this thing licked without the vaccines. Is there not a political opportunity here?
Well, I unless Bill wants to go first this time, I guess I could jump in. I mean, let me just begin by saying that, yes, this is a huge, major problem, a public health problem in this country. I mean, the New York Times runs a chart on the bottom of their homepage they have for over a year now, in which they show the number of new cases and the number of deaths over the last 14 days with a percentage change. And for about the last 5 months until about 2 weeks ago, it was negative, because every 2 weeks the number was down from 2 weeks ago. About a week and a half ago, it started to become positive again. And for instance, just this morning, Thursday morning, the percentage change from 2 weeks ago in new cases is up 109%. And now the number of deaths is also going up, 17% up. And this is just going to get worse. We know this from some other countries like the UK, where the numbers are going up with the Delta virus. So it's terrible. For whether it's an opportunity politically, I'm just not sure. I mean, I'm a little hesitant to say that Democrats should be hitting the right on this, just because there's no chance that politicizing this even further is going to help. And so in that respect, it might, if our goal is to get more people to relent in their perverse skepticism about the vaccines and actually get the shot, the proper response might be to say as little as possible about it, and to just maybe have the government, like the Biden administration, put out a lot of PR campaign that is kind of unpolitical, just pure public health messaging, to try to implore the people who are now starting to die in these red areas of the country to please get the shot, without turning it into a political football. That's what my instinct says. Now, if we're just going to talk pure, like, rank political advantage, I have no doubt that that this could help Democrats somewhat, because it could convince Democrats even more that the other half of the country are just lunatics and crazy, and we should never, ever let them do or have any power. But whether that would actually accomplish anything actually good for our public health situation, I'm a little skeptical, I guess.
Bill, one of the things that I think continues to contribute to the vaccine hesitancy is the idea that this is still an experimental drug, and it has the emergency use authorization still attached to it. But of course, it's been given now to, I don't know, over 300 million people. I haven't heard much from the Biden administration about lifting that authorization, because I think that's one of the things that could help. Why hasn't the Biden administration sort of pushed harder to get the FDA to lift that? Do you know?
I don't know. Having said that, I'm a little bit skeptical that would make a big difference at this point. I think that the vaccine issue, not only has it become politicized, it is a part of a "don't tread on me" in ideology run wild. It's being framed as a freedom issue. It's being framed as a "don't mess with my precious bodily fluids" issue. If you look at surveys among Republicans, they are afraid of side effects. They are afraid of fertility effects. And I am not convinced that this opposition is any more in the sphere of evidence. I think it's in a different place altogether. If I wanted to be cynical and cruel, I would say that we're about to see one more victory for the theory of natural selection.
I'm glad Bill said that, because I was about to say the same thing. I mean, look, this is almost a test case. What happens when you have a virulent disease that is capable of killing, and even if not killing, of rendering people permanently disabled in one way or another? And we are sort of naturally selecting for the people who are the most educated, who live along the coasts, who vote Democratic. They're all getting vaccinated, and the people who aren't getting vaccinated, and therefore who are going to be getting the disease, dying from the disease, and being harmed by the disease, are Republicans. And I can't fathom how this is going to help Republicans and the Republican Party. I mean, I think this is very damaging. And I think what you're going to see is not, I agree with you, Sarah, that it would be a good idea for the Biden administration. I think they are in due course considering lifting that experimental level. But I also think that private decisions, private industry is going to come in to play. Colleges and universities are already requiring that students who want to return to campus do in fact have to be fully vaccinated. I've got grandsons, one going to Carnegie Mellon and the other to the University of Maryland. They cannot show up on campus and check into their dorms without proof of vaccination. Companies are making this decision. You're seeing hospitals, the University of Houston Hospital lost 150 or so employees who refused to get vaccinated. So I think you're going to see a kind of separating going on between the ignorant and the anti-vaxxers and those who are smart enough to want to protect themselves. And it's not going to redound to the benefit of the ignorant.
Yeah, I mean, Linda, just on this, I mean, don't you remember when anti-vaxxers to me was like a left-wing thing? Mm-hmm. Like it was like hippies who didn't want to get vaccinated. And I guess, you brought something up earlier about sort of the wokeism on the left. And, I look at the dollars that are getting put up on some of these programs, and the deficit hawk in me just, screeches. But when I look at something like the way that the Republican, both the infotainment set and then the vast majority of its more responsible political set, or I don't mean responsible, I guess I mean, governors, with the exception of people like, Cox in Utah and Asia Hutchinson, who's been trying to make this case, the vast majority of people are either actively anti, sort of not necessarily anti-vaccine, but anti that the government should be encouraging people to take the vaccine, or they're actively pushing bad information about the vaccine. Like at some point, that kind of thing is what overwhelms me to say this is not a political party that is worthy of being in leadership.
That's right.
That judgment is just too awful. People, I mean, we've already lost over 600,000 people. And look, one of this is what makes me crazy about it. And part of the reason I tend to get soapboxy is that the Delta variant, right? The vaccines are holding up against them, but of course they're slightly less effective against the Delta variant because these new, the variants, they change because they find places where they can, take root and change. And it's what's going to happen. And like, it doesn't have to. Like, we literally have this miracle drug sitting there,
I know.
and we could stop the thing in its tracks. And I don't blame these individuals nearly as much as I blame these Republican elites who, for either wedge politics or personal enrichment of some kind, or just a way to try to show a perverse kind of leadership, are putting people's lives in danger. And to me, those are the kinds of things that just overwhelm my other normal political policy frustrations with Democrats.
Yeah. Would you like to take a bet on whether Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham have had a vaccine? I mean, I bet.
Yeah, I'll put my money on that they do.
Yeah, of course they do, and yet they get on there and spew that that just dishonest anti-vax garbage every night of the week. I mean, it's just amazing to me. And as I say, it's really in a more profound way than almost anything else. It is going to polarize this country into parts of the country that are sick, in which people are dying, and parts of the country that are thriving, in which people are protected.
Okay, so let's move on to something that I will try to get my blood pressure down, although it's up about this too. So yesterday, Joe Biden gave a big speech about voting rights. He called out the big lie. He was, he called it the new Jim Crow. He called the bills that Republicans are advancing to restrict voting rights, an existential threat to democracy. He was, had his fists up saying, "Have you no shame?" And then he kind of, he's right about all of that. Agree with all of it. But then he kind of says, and that's why as soon as Congress passes the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, he's going to sign it. But I was just sort of struck by the fact that, okay, but the problem here is everybody knows there's no path to getting that done without blowing up the filibuster or some other kind of filibuster reform. He seemed to be relying on the speech a lot on sort of the DOJ and Merrick Garland to do a lot of the heavy lifting by challenging the Republican bills in court. But Damon, what do you think? When Biden gives that speech, obviously he's trying to send a message that this matters, and he was using the most, intense rhetoric about it, and yet there doesn't seem to be a real solution in sight.
No, I agree. I think the message from Biden was very much, remember the old line, message, I care. That was what the first George H.W. Bush said that. I do think that he's sort of trying to convince rank and file Democrats that by Biden himself, he is doing as much as he can on this issue, but ultimately it's up to Congress, and he can browbeat Joe Manchin, but Biden won 30% of the vote in West Virginia. So, I mean, Manchin requires Democratic votes, but these are in order to keep his office and support, but these are Democratic voters in West Virginia, so their priorities are a little different than Democratic activists. My own view of this whole constellation of issues is a little muddled, because I think by far, by a factor of about 10, the most important issue in having to do with voting rights has to do with the kind of nonsense that some Republicans are doing around the country, having to do with giving legislatures the power to take away the final say in certifying vote counts from election commissions. Now, that is the kind of thing that if it had been in place after the last election, could potentially have led, certified victories for Joe Biden to be overturned by Republican state legislatures, which would have not automatically led Trump to win, but would have sent the entire process into a total spin out of chaos. That is a true big lie and a very, very dangerous path. Now, that's the big threat. The problem is that the bills, especially the For the People Act, is really not about that at all. That was written a couple of years ago as a messaging bill. It's filled with all kinds of stuff, some of which I think is okay, much of which I think is pretty bad and will not stand up to scrutiny in the courts anyway. And the Democrats, including Joe Biden, have attached this kind of apocalyptic hyperbole to that, when that rhetoric belongs attached on the narrower threat. And there's really very little being done to address that threat, the threat that in 2024, Biden could win the vote, and then Trump, the Republican nominee, could tell 5 swing state legislatures controlled by Republicans, oh, there was just voter fraud, overturn it and let's make me the winner. That's a potential true disaster for this country, and it's what we really should be focused on. So I hear Biden's rhetoric, and there's something sort of performative and unreal about it in a way that I don't think is necessarily that productive, but I don't have a great alternative because there is no bill that actually addresses this real, more serious problem.
Well, actually, I mean, that was actually what I was sort of confused about. So I completely agree with you that the subversion is the biggest threat, and that there's nothing in any of these bills that addresses it. But we did have this moment a couple of weeks ago where, look, the HR1, the For the People Act, it's over. They couldn't get to cloture on it. It was never going to get anywhere. It's a big Democratic wish list, all kinds of stuff in it, some of which is good, some of which I object to. But there was a moment where Manchin then came back and said, look, here's what I would do. And he put some bullets down that were pretty sensible. There was really only 1 or 2 provisions in there that I wasn't wild about. Stacey, and he included a voter ID provision, which Stacey Abrams then sort of just immediately out of the gate endorses. And boom, it looks like there's this opportunity to advance something that is much narrower. And I guess I thought Biden's speech was going to try to pick up on that thread and push that kind of compromise, at least on the Democrat side, bringing all the sort of Democratic factions together and try to push that forward. And I was surprised that wasn't really in there, Bill. And I guess, you talked about whether or not voting rights would be a motivating political issue, but they don't have that much more time to get this done if they're going to do it. And when they talk about it, when Biden talks about it in those terms, can you tell me, do you know what the affirmative strategy is here?
I do not. And I think President Biden gave that speech because he had to. He'd come under intense pressure from activists who were saying that he was neglecting that issue in favor of other things that, although worthy, they regard as much less important, indeed central, to the future of the Democratic Party and the country. The Democratic Party didn't exactly rally around Manchin's bill. And of course, Mitch McConnell went from Republican senator to Republican senator, asking them as a personal favor not to back it. And they didn't. So this is sort of murder on the Orient Express. There are a lot of people with knives. But let me now segue to Damon's very apt remarks about where the core threat lies, which is in legislative subversion of the electoral process. It is perfectly true that we haven't seen a lot of proposals dealing with this threat. And I think the reason is that it's not clear that any proposals could deal with this threat. If you look at the language of Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, you will find words. I'm not looking at them, but I'm coming close to quoting them from memory. Each state shall select, comma, in such manner as the legislature thereof may prescribe, comma, a number of electors equal to, and then the familiar formula. And it is not clear what the Congress of the United States could do to limit that apparent plenipotentiary grant of power to the state legislature. There's even an ambiguity as to whether the governor of a state can be involved in that process constitutionally. Now, a lot of people are pointing to the fact that every single state in the country has a network of laws interpreting for that state what the manner of selection will be. But what a legislature can do, a legislature can undo. And if a number of red states decide to undo the restraints on legislative discretion and leave it to the legislature to make the final determination, I think we need a very searching constitutional conversation about whether there's any provision in the Constitution to give the power to the federal government to tell the states what to do in that regard. And I'm not sure that there is, but I think it would be a good idea to get someone who really understands that issue constitutionally on this show sooner rather than later.
Linda, do you know constitutionally what the answer is?
I won't claim to be that person. However, I mean, Bill is right when he's talking about essentially, the electors for the Electoral College selecting the president. But Article 1, I think it's Section 2, and I don't have it in front of me either, does in fact give state legislatures the right to set the manner, time, and place of elections for Congress, for their own members. It was the House at the time the Constitution was drafted, because senators were not directly elected. And it also, however, says somewhere in that article that it can be preempted by federal law. So I absolutely agree. In fact, I wrote a long piece in the Bulwark last week about the Voting Rights Act. I absolutely agree that the existential threat is not so much in denying access to the polls, because there's a lot more access to the polls now. To claim that even some of the bad bills that the Republican legislatures are passing are somehow a return to Jim Crow, that I think is really unfortunate language. And I think that, you cry wolf one too many times and then nobody believes anything that you're saying. So I think it's unfortunate that Biden framed these legislative challenges in terms of Jim Crow. It's not Jim Crow. They are, in fact, restricting some of the loosened rules that came into play last year because of the pandemic. I happen to think that's a good idea to have more people voting, and I wouldn't mind seeing a federal law that determines time, manner, and place for federal legislative elections that was more generous and more in keeping with what we saw in 2020. But I think that it doesn't serve the Democrats or the president well to be framing it in the way he is. And I would rather see some time spent doing something like Senator Manchin was trying to do, which was that he would put down some markers, and we'd talk about perhaps a federal law that put into place certain principles, and that I think would be good policy.
Okay. I'm scouring for a constitutional scholar who knows all about this, the subversion sort of provisions, but I couldn't come up with one for this moment. So we're going to have to move into our highlights and lowlights section and save that for another episode. Who wants to go first for their highlights or lowlights? Should I just call on you? I guess I'll start with you, Bill.
Well, I always offer very serious highlights or lowlights. I frequently talk about alarming surveys or other grim trends in the body republic. I want to break that streak. I have just finished a novel called The Netanyahus. Just came out, reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review last Sunday. That is to say, 2 days ago. And it is screamingly funny. It's not fair. It's a caricature. But for anybody who knows anything about either academic life or the Netanyahus, there are a number of passages and set pieces that will just have you roaring because it's so spot on. As it happens, I was an undergraduate at Cornell, which is where the Netanyahus finally came when Ben-Zion Netanyahu got an appointment as professor of medieval history. I know a number of people who studied with him. And so it was, in every sense of the word, a guilty pleasure. And I don't think I will be alone in savoring it.
Thanks, Bill. Linda, what about you?
Well, I have a piece to recommend in the Bulwark. It's by an old friend with whom I don't always agree, Elliot Abrams, and he wrote a piece called As Cubans March for Freedom, Democrats Are Split. And he talks about the demonstrations that have been taking place in various cities in Cuba against the government there, headed by Mr. Diaz-Canel. It is a remarkable thing that has been taking place where you have thousands and thousands of demonstrators in cities, not just Havana, but in cities throughout the island. And the government has now begun to crack down on them. And he talks about it in terms of, democratic policy on Cuba. And of course, the Obama rollback of various prohibitions against travel there and spending money there. And Trump, of course, reversed much of that. And President Biden has not been as quick as I think some on the left would like in reversing Trump's reversal of the Obama doctrine in Cuba. And I think that is a good thing. And so does Mr. Abrams. So it's well worth a read.
If I could just chime in for a minute, I think this is a massive opportunity for President Biden to back up his pro-democracy theme that has been so central to his foreign policy, and to send a signal that he is not simply a captive either of the president he served or of a faction of the Democratic Party with which he probably doesn't agree on this point.
Great. Damon, what about you?
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm sort of tooting the Bulwark's horn here, I did want to
toot away.
Yeah, all right, I'm tooting. Basically, I think of anything that was released this week in print or digitally, the most important piece out there is an essay. I think it's about 12,000 words long. So, you're going to want to print it out and keep it around for a while. It'll take a while, but it is worth it. It's an essay titled What the Hell Happened to the Claremont Institute, subtitled How the Once Distinguished Conservative Think Tank Plunged into Trumpism, Illiberalism, and Lying About the Election. The author, Laura Field, writes fairly regularly for the Bulwark. She's also a fellow at Niskanen with Linda. I don't always agree with her. She's actually written a critical essay that took aim at me and Andrew Sullivan and some other centrists just after the last election, because we, in turn, took potshots at the left that she didn't agree with. But this essay is just superb. It's a kind of thoroughly exhaustive and definitive examination of what has happened to the Claremont Institute, which has been around for a long time, had a huge influence on the right for many decades, and used to be a genuine source of political philosophical illumination, and has descended over the last 5 years into exactly what the subtitle listed, a kind of rally around Trump, a kind of boosterism for liberal politics, and even going along with, in a kind of winking way, trying to have it both ways about the election. So anyone out there who's interested in kind of trends on the right and their intellectual correlates, this is a real must read. So please take a look out for it at the Bulwark.
Thanks, Damon. Yeah, it's a real tour de force. And as a little crossover promo, it is what Tim and JVL and I spent a lot of this morning talking about on the next level, where we kind of dug into some of the internecine elements of this, conservative, the shift in the sort of conservative intellectual world. So for mine, I'm going to circle back to the beginning, to CPAC, and I believe it is the 4-year anniversary of Mona Charen going to CPAC and telling the truth on stage. She was sitting on a panel, I believe in 2017, where it was a Me Too panel. And it was, meant to be everybody talk about how the left are hypocrites on issues of sexual harassment, et cetera. And Mona on stage says, the guy in the White House has the biggest Me Too problem in the country. This Republican Party has just recently endorsed Roy Moore, who was accused of pedophilia and trying to date or have relationships with much, much younger women or girls. And she just gave it to them. And man, I rewatched the clip, as I do just about every year around CPAC time. And people start to boo and yell. And it was, this is back when I still thought there was kind of the normal party was kind of still in there, but she had to be escorted out by security. People were so mad to have somebody just, I don't know, say something that didn't comport with their comfortable assumptions about what they should be hearing with their snowflake ears at CPAC. But it was one of the bravest, it was in such short supply, the bravery. And I remember every time I watch it, it makes me cheer inside. And so since she's not here, I'm just going to remind people, if you're as big a fan of Mona as I am, which you probably are since you listen to the show, you should go watch that clip. It's amazing. So with that, thank you all for having me today. And thank you for listening to Beg to Differ. We will be back next week, and Mona will be back here as well. Thanks very much.